Reviving the old Silk Road. China pledges billions of dollars for massive new trade routes over land and sea. Can the mega project succeed? Who will benefit? How will it change global trade? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. China's President Xi Jinping is hosting a two-day summit where he's attempting to win support for an ambitious economic project that could transform world trade. It's called the One Belt, One Road initiative, a modern take on the old Silk Road. Well, the project aims to create a vast network of new trade routes in Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe. Now, many argue by championing this massive project, China aims to make trade with the rest of the world easier. We'll go to our guests in a minute, but first, this report from Adrian Brown at the summit in Beijing.
President, Communist Party General Secretary, and now chief salesman for a project that aims to put China at the center of world trade.
China is ready to share our development progress, but will not interfere in the internal issues of other countries.
Leader after leader voiced support for President Xi's speech and its implicit anti-protectionist message. The president made no reference to North Korea's latest missile test, but he warned the Belt Road Initiative could only succeed in a stable environment.
We should intensify counterterrorism efforts, address both its symptoms and root causes, and strive to end poverty.
Diplomacy to end the North Korean crisis appears to have begun on the sidelines of this summit, with representatives from both Koreas meeting very briefly, raising hopes of more talk soon. A lot's been written about an initiative that aims to bind China to Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe through a series of new economic trade routes. The infrastructure will include ports, highways and rail links. On Sunday, President Xi Jinping raised China's total pledge to $124 billion. Analysts say the scheme will require a lot more money. This has been a powerful display of Chinese soft power. On Sunday, President Xi Jinping sought to reassure the world that his project is not about China trying to expand its geopolitical clout. But that's the way it seems to neighbors like India and Japan, which is why their leaders aren't here. China excels at events like this: rigid organization and, of course, no dissent. Others who declined the invitation to attend included most leaders of the European Union and US President Donald Trump. But that collective diplomatic snub was in the end surpassed by the actions of China's supposed ally, North Korea. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
So what will the project look like? Well, it's renewing trade links along the ancient Silk Road, as we mentioned, expanding infrastructure between Asia, Africa and Europe. More than 65 countries are involved, representing 60% of the global population and somewhere between 40 to 60% of global GDP. It includes land routes, new roads, rail lines from China to Europe, Laos and Thailand, and sea routes too, because China has bought ports in Turkey and Pakistan. Now, President Xi raised China's total pledge to $124 billion. Analysts say the scheme will require a lot more money. China expects to import $2 trillion worth of products from countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative over the next 5 years. Let's go to our guests now. We have joining us from Hong Kong, Pauline Leung. She's the Managing Director of Asia Analytica. In New Delhi via Skype, Jabin T. Jacob, Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and also via Skype in London, Bruno Macais, a former junior minister for Europe in the Portuguese government. Welcome to the show. If I could start with Pauline. So when you look at some of those figures I mentioned there, Pauline, 60% of the world population, 75% of the planet's energy resources, it sounds like this project has the potential, at least, to reshape the world, does it?
Yes, if everything goes as everybody hopes it will go smoothly, with no problems, yes, it could reshape the world. But the big question there is, there are so many obvious hurdles and problems that the problem side of the project is going to dominate, at least in the first few years.
Let's talk a little bit about some of those problems. Bruno, the project's economic stats may conceal the fact of the multiple technical, administrative, infrastructural, even cultural differences amongst the different countries. Is there any appetite to actually bridge some of those divides?
It will be difficult, but then the first thing they tell you if you talk to those responsible in Beijing is that this is a 30-year project, not a 5-year project, not a 10-year project. So there's going to be lots of bumps on the road, some technical, others have to do with security. Paulina already raised that issue, and we've seen obstacles that are really daunting when it comes to security in areas like Pakistan, Afghanistan. And then I think also a growing sense, which was not there at the beginning, but it's starting to be there, that this could be a threat for some of the major economic players in the world, like the United States and the European Union. That will also be a major obstacle.
Do you expect, Bruno, that there will be perhaps some kind of moves against it or to undermine it from some of those key global players?
No, but I don't think so. Not in those terms. But the project requires engagement. The project requires cooperation. And I think we're going to see that on different levels from countries like Russia, European Union, and the United States. When it comes to the European Union, for example, we've seen a number of countries, 3 or 4 in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, that are truly engaged with the project, and other countries are not at all. So I think we're going to see a lot of that. It's an obstacle for China, of course. China wants countries to play their part in the initiative, not just to watch.
Jabin, the region covers an area that's estimated to have a serious infrastructure deficit, something to the tune of 26 trillion US dollars. Who's going to come up with the money for that sort of development?
Well, China is certainly making a big effort to bridge that gap. But, you also need to remember it's not only China, but several other regional economies, including the Americans and the Japanese, who have also put in a lot of money into infrastructure projects in Asia for several decades now. India itself has several connectivity projects running across boundaries for several years now. Of course, China dwarfs many of these projects in scale, in the way it sells them. But unlike other countries, China hasn't really worked out some of the technical detail that was mentioned, some of the problems that might arise. Other countries sort of play it, shall we say, slowly, gradually, try and take as many stakeholders on board as possible. So transparency is a big issue as far as the Chinese are concerned. And I think some of those problems are likely to crop up as we go along.
Jabin, take us through some of the technical details that haven't been ironed out.
Well, for one, just take railways, for example. Each of these countries across Asia have different gauges for their railway tracks. So that's something that needs to be fixed. At the moment, they are just transported from one coach, from one gauge to the other. Then there are issues of, questions of currency management, financial transactions, all of this. China is also trying to use this as a vehicle for the internationalization of the renminbi. But quite a few countries, including allies, its so-called allies, are uncomfortable using the Chinese renminbi. They still prefer the US dollar. So there are transaction costs that can come into the picture as well.
All right, let's take some of those points, if I may. We'll come back to you in a moment, Jabin. Let me take some of those points to Pauline. What is the official line from Chinese officials when they talk about or when they address some of these challenges? One that often comes up is one which Jabin pointed to there, that the railway tracks alone don't always line up.
Yes, well, the official line in China, not just on the Silk Road project, but on most things involving government policy, is to be upbeat, positive, and vague. So it's very difficult to pinpoint, for instance, where the rest of the funding will come from. But if I could go back to a question you posed earlier about will other countries seek to undermine the project, and I think it would be safe to say no, because there are so many problems without undermining the project, that there is no need to do anything more. The technical problems, the logistical problems, regulations, geopolitical rivalries, that is enough on China's plate. And there's no need for anybody to even think of putting any more on it.
Well, hang on, Pauline. I mean, if you let me be devil's advocate, as they say for a minute here, President Xi, when he's talking about this project, talked about how he sees it as an alternative model to rivalries. Are you saying this can't be something that suppresses those rivalries and shows people in the region they have more to benefit from trading with each other rather than trying to compete and be rivals?
Players in the region, countries in the region, take ASEAN for instance, have always taken the attitude, let's do business rather than fight. It's easier said than done. When you're talking about business, okay, you talk about business. But when you're talking about border, India and Pakistan, for instance, India has expressed concern over sovereignty because one of the link to Pakistan supposedly cross over Indian territory. So it is an ideal that all countries say they aim for. But when it comes down to it, it's very difficult to find a solution where everybody is going to play nice with each other.
In a sense, Jabin, is China now emerging as the leader of the new free trade movement in the world, as the US apparently is heading towards more protectionism under President Donald Trump?
I think that's a bit of an overstatement. Talk is easy. What we need to see is what happens in practice. And I think in practice, just take India's own trade negotiations with or trading problems with China, we find that there are several non-tariff barriers to entry into the Chinese market for some of the products that we are the most competitive in. For example, pharmaceuticals, IT products, and so on. So I think, and even now, even in the case of Pakistan, for example, the Pakistan Business Council, which is an association of Pakistan enterprises, have actually, made a report of the 2007 China-Pakistan FTA and found that this was actually working against Pakistani interests. Pakistan has actually lost jobs. So in addition to the jobs promised under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, this corridor will also have to compensate Pakistan for the jobs lost in the last 7 years. So I think to call China an exemplar of free trade, I think that's overstating matters.
So is this, Bruno, really about creating a one-way directional free trade impact on the global movement of goods and services, sort of the freedom to export Chinese goods to the rest of the world, but a good dosage of protectionism back home in Chinese markets?
Yeah, that's quite correct. In my current job, I work with some European companies that want to enter the Chinese market, and they can't. The obstacles continue to be very, very significant. I think China is interested in opening up on its own terms, slowly.
Might any of that change, though, as a result of a project like this? I mean, to quote, again, quote the official line here, $2 trillion worth of products from other countries participating in this initiative over the next 5 years.
Right, I think that is changing. I was in EU in China recently, and I was there actually when a train arrived from Spain, sort of an early symbol of the New Silk Road. And he was bringing, of course, the Spanish products, unique Spanish products that the Chinese are very interested in, like wine and sunflower oil, things like that. But of course, that's not really what Europeans are interested in primarily. That's not going to be very significant. And China continues to be very close on financial services, on the new artificial intelligence sector, things like that, which will be more important. I think China will slowly open up, and this will help. But again, it will be on its own terms. And the idea is that China is going to be the center of the new global networks being created. And this, for Europe and for the United States and for Japan to some extent, is going to be difficult to accept. We're used to being at the center. So I think this is where there's a possibility for a certain clash of visions. And let me just say quickly that, for example, Russia, in public, we see President Putin very engaged and is there in Beijing today. In private, Russian diplomats will tell you, and it's not a secret, that they're very worried and that they're afraid that the Russian Far East and Siberia will become even more of a backwater than they already are. Because, of course, these trade routes are going to go through the south, and the famous Trans-Siberian will become, it is already in this repair, will become really a sort of a historical monument more than an active trade link.
All right, so the aim perhaps, Pauline, to make China the centre. But the centre of what? If this is not a free trade area, it's not an Asian version of the EU, what is it then?
Basically, I see this not just as a trade and business project, but it's also to do with international relations. I think China is trying to protect and safeguard its international relations in a world that is changing very fast, where there are lots of risks and lots of doubts about what's happening. So if you have a good business relationship, a good trade relationship, no matter how small, it also helps to ease any bilateral friction that there may be. So I think that aspect of it matters just as much to China as the commercial aspect.
Now, India is one country.
Also, you know,
Right,
your
go
point
ahead,
about
Pauline.
the, $2 trillion. $2 trillion. The devil is in the detail. I mean, for instance, the Chinese could say, we want to buy $500 billion worth of goods from the US in the high-tech area, exactly the area where the US will not sell to China. So, you know, you've got to look at the details, not just at the headline numbers.
All right, well, India is not participating, of course, in this project. Jabin, India is focusing on other projects, though, the North-South Transport Corridor. Are we going to see an increase in rivalry rather than a decrease, at least when it comes to the relations between India and China?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Pauline when she said, we don't really need to complicate matters because China has plenty on its plate already. All of these projects can run in parallel with each other. These don't have to compete. But the more important question from India's perspective is the one that you asked Pauline just now. What is this about? And as far as India is concerned, this is not just an economic project. This is not just an infrastructure connectivity project, because there are several of these already around. But this is about bringing China front and center to the front and center of Asian politics once again. And China has.
Isn't that, some would say, Jabin, isn't that inevitable right now, especially if the US is heading towards some kind of retreat? India can't challenge Chinese, the ascent of China, can it?
No, it's not about challenging the ascent of China, but it's about holding China to at least what it's rhetoric. I mean, you hear President Xi Jinping's speech here just now. The point is, if China is so insistent about protecting its sovereignty, well, then naturally India will also have similar interests in protecting its core interests, its sovereignty, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. That's number one. Number two, this is not, all of these projects are actually backed by cultural exchanges, people-to-people contacts, but again, with a certain twist, if I might say so. This is about putting forward a particular kind of history, a particular kind of politics in which China predominates. And I think, just look at the expression Silk Road. I mean, the way the Chinese sell it, it's as if the ancient Silk Road belonged to China, ignoring the contributions of other civilizations, other peoples in this entire enterprise. So I think,
but isn't that the point which the Chinese president is making, again, to be devil's advocate here, when he's inviting so many heads of states and so many countries to participate in it? From his perspective, could he not argue, well, I'm trying to internationalize it and have everybody have a piece of the cake?
So that's true, but the point is, again, the devil is in the details. He might invite everybody on, but at the very basic level, all of these projects are run bilaterally. These are not multilateral projects. The projects are China with one country, China with the other. So It's not as if it were a multilateral, if it had a multilateral structure, rules, terms of agreement, then we would say yes. I mean, India did participate.
That is a very important point. That is a very good point. I want to explore that further, perhaps with Bruno. I mean, India is one country that is warning that this project will end up drowning countries in unsustainable debt burdens because perhaps for the reason which Jabin is talking about there, the way that the deals are being structured and put together, is it sound economics from everybody's perspective?
What remains to be seen. There's a real danger that we're going to have a number of white elephants. I visited some of them in Central Asia. At first, you're struck, why is this huge port being built here, the place on Earth farthest away from any ocean, so a dry port of enormous capacity being built in Hormuz. On the other hand, so this is the negative side. On the other hand, we know that there's a huge deficit of infrastructure in those regions, in particular in Central Asia. We know that they have enormous economic potential, highly educated workforce. So I think if China is careful about it, it has the right monitoring mechanisms. If it has a long view over 30, 40 years, I think eventually the economic benefits will be there and the risks can be minimized. I'm actually more concerned about the security risks because as you start to uphand and to change the global system, even if you're trying to do it with a cooperative frame of mind, the risks are high. And I think we've seen India is a particular case of that. Just 1 or 2 weeks ago, an Indian citizen was sentenced to death in Pakistan for what were, the case is still unclear, what were presumably spying activities related to the Belt and Road, to the One Belt, One Road. So I think this is only the start of what could be, if it is not well managed, a very tricky and even in some cases a dangerous process. So I just hope everyone is aware of that.
Let's take that point to Pauline. I mean, how does Beijing plan to mitigate against the security risk? It does run through, this project does run through some tricky areas, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And that is one of the areas where I think China is exposing itself to very big risks. Right now, the players in this project are all the state-owned banks and the state-owned enterprises. There's hardly any private sector involvement at all. So I've read in one of the state newspapers that last year, the 4 state-owned banks together lent $90 billion to various OBOR projects. Now, because infrastructure projects have a long lead time, so things may not go sour next year or even in the next 3 years. But if it does do so, then China is at great risk. There is no collateral as such. So you help someone build a road, they default. What do? You can't dig up the road and bring back the cement. Or if you help someone build a port, you start quarreling, they say, okay, I'm going to nationalize the port. So I actually see a big risk for China in doing this.
All right. I think we've just got a minute left. Let me give it to Jabin. When we look at other initiatives which China is keen on, whether it's the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the opening up of Arctic shipping routes, what sort of picture is emerging of how global trade is changing?
I think China's primary interest is its domestic politics, domestic economy. The opening up the Arctic route and the RCEP negotiations, the One Belt, One Road, all of these tie into China's domestic interests at the political level, at the economic level. I think the questions of One Belt, One Road are particularly worrisome, I would say, because of these security issues that were just mentioned. I mean, I don't think China is going to be as, shall we say, cumbersome as to push countries to the extent that they will oppose some of these projects. I think what China is going to do is, well, okay, you can't repay us, fine, then we'll just take an equity, we'll just take care of the land around this particular project. And that's the sort of thing that is already happening in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka. So I think those are the issues that countries that are hosting One Belt, One Road projects, as well as their neighbors, need to be worried about. And China, I don't think, has done the kind of homework to see what kind of reactions that will engender.
Okay. All right, well, I guess time will tell how much homework has been done. For now, let's thank our guests, Pauline Lung, Jabin Jacob, and Bruno Macias. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJInsideStory. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here for now, thanks for watching.